I think 90 episodes into this project, it's pretty clear that the disk system became a bit of a dumping ground for the low-end projects that no one really wanted to take a chance on. Basically, if it wasn't by Nintendo or Konami, then it was very likely to be junk. So it is really strange that Taito released Bubble Bobble on the disk system. This was their biggest smash hit arcade game of 1986, a game that already had gained universal acclaim, and they put it on the disk system rather than use a cartridge. Of course, it could have been a bad port. I mean, some of the staff who worked on this version of Bubble Bobble were new hires for Taito, coming over from the team that made Super Monkey Daiboken. But the port was just about perfect. It's hard to imagine that it could have turned out any better. Bubble Bobble is all about Bub and Bob, just two normal guys who were hanging out until a wizard came along and stole their girlfriends. The wizard also turned them into dinosaurs that happened to have very convenient abilities that would let them defeat all of the wizard's minions. It's weird how often evil wizards will turn somebody into a creature that has some kind of power that will let them beat the wizard. As you're playing, A jumps and B spits out a bubble. Your goal on every stage except for the very final one is to trap all of the enemies in bubbles and then pop the bubble. You can pop bubbles by jumping into them, running them into walls. Just don't let the enemy break free on their own, otherwise they'll get angry and speed up. When you pop a bubble that contains an enemy, it turns into some kind of collectible item. Usually a fruit or vegetable, but sometimes you'll get something else. And you collect these for points. After you defeat the final enemy on a stage, you're given a few seconds to collect whatever items have fallen, and then you're sucked up to the next level. Getting around on stages can be a bit non-intuitive at first glance, though it doesn't take too long to get the feel for it. You can jump up through any surface, and if there's an open area above it, then you can land on that floor. If you fall off the bottom of the screen, then you wind up at the top, and that is true for enemies as well as yourself. You can hop off your own bubbles and use those to get to a higher point, but the timing for that is really tricky. In fact, I'd consider that to be the worst aspect of the game. There are a lot of stages that require that you use your own bubbles to hop out of certain holes, and the way that the bubbles interact with the stages makes it super difficult to do this repeatedly, which is what you'll inevitably have to do. You'll miss that perfect jump, and then all of the bubbles that are touching the one that you contacted pop, and then you're back at the bottom. Another complication with the bubbles is that these stages have a certain airflow to them that guide the bubbles around. So you'll see that bubbles tend to collect in certain areas. That can be helpful when it pulls a bunch of enemies together for you, or it could be sending the bubbles that you need to bounce off of to someplace that you don't want them to be. If you linger too long on a stage, then you're told to hurry, and in this state, all of the enemies speed up, plus an invincible ghost appears to chase you down. If you die, everything goes back to normal, and of course the ghost stops if you manage to defeat all of the remaining enemies. Any contact with an enemy is fatal in Bubble Bobble, and you have 3 lives when you start out. Fortunately, you have as many continues as you need to complete the game. And whenever you get a game over, you can save your progress. Though being able to save doesn't mean it's easy. This is a long game, and a lot of the stages get pretty mean. Besides the bonus points that appear on stages, there are a lot of special items to collect. I mean, a lot. There's roughly 50 things that will appear on stages that have some kind of special effect. That is way too many for me to try to cover here, but to hit a few of the high points, there's 3 kinds of candy that change how your bubbles behave, an item that effectively ends the stage and turns it into a special bonus mode where you're competing with a second player to collect items, bubbles with letters in them, and if you spell the word extend, you get an extra life, items that destroy all of the enemies on the screen, and even some level warps. The most ubiquitous special things that will appear are bubbles that spontaneously generate on their own and can be used to attack enemies. You've got water that will flow back and forth until it falls off the stage, lightning that shoots the opposite way that you're facing when you touch the bubble, and fire that drops down and coats the ground below you, possibly bogging you down as well as destroying any enemies. There's over 100 regular stages in the game, and there's only one boss, found at the very end. One cruel aspect of Bubble Bobble is that you can only beat the game if you're playing 2 players. The 2-player mode lets both players go simultaneously, and you can both help and hinder each other. If you don't have a second player out when you defeat the final boss, then you're thrown back about 50 stages. If you manage to defeat the final boss with 2 players, well, then another nasty surprise is waiting for you, because you go on to Super Bubble Bobble, which is just the same stages all over again, except the enemies have changed, and there's different items that appear. If you defeat all of the stages in Super Bubble Bobble, and then beat the final boss with 2 players, then you finally get to see the ending. Of course, the end of the game wasn't the end for Bub and Bob. They essentially became Taito's mascots, turning up in a ton of games. And the Bubble Bobble series itself goes on for a long time. In fact, there's 3 completely different games that all state that they are Bubble Bobble too. I'm sure this will be a huge shock to you, but Bubble Bobble is a beloved classic in Japan, though more for the arcade version than the FDS one. Remember that the Disk System wasn't the most popular of platforms, and that seems to have limited people's exposure to this port. And of course, I think it's a fantastic game. It even has one of the all-time greatest video game melodies. It's hard to find a game this charming, this enjoyable to play, with this much action going on. The variety of stages and items is just absurd, and to cap it all off, the 2-player mode is really great. The only reason not to play Bubble Bobble on the Disk System is because you're playing one of the better ports. This really is a masterpiece.